Welcome back to Korean Cinema Today, the podcast of the Korean Film Council. I'm very pleased to have a very special guest in the studio today with me, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the recent independent Korean films that have been a hit around the world on the global festival circuit. So my name is Pierce. I'm your host today. Normally we would have our co-host Jun Kim. Unfortunately, she's a little bit under the weather, so she was not able to join us. We're here in Seoul. We're down in a basement studio in Hongdae, if you're curious to know about that. And if you want to know about Korean films, the best place to go is our website, which is koreanfilm.or.kr. You can get the latest news and features and box office there, and make sure to subscribe to our newsletter, our webzine, which is also called Korean Cinema Today. And you can find this podcast again on iTunes and on the website by searching for Korean Cinema Today. Make sure to engage with us also on social media. You can find us on Twitter. Our handle is @KoreanFilmBiz. That's B-I-Z. Or on Facebook, you can find us at facebook.com/KoBiz.KOFIC. All right, so let's get straight into it. I'd like to introduce our very special guest today. So we have Darcy Packett, who has, of course, been with us a number of times, one of the very greatest experts on Korean film. He is the founder of KoreanFilm.org and is a professor at Kyunghee University, and is also the founder of the recently started Wildflower Independent Film Awards, which we will definitely be touching on a little bit later. So welcome back, Darcy. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
So today we're talking about independent film. Here in Korea, of course, it's all about the films that people know about, the films that people see. Those that make money are, of course, the commercial films. And there's a number of reasons for that, which we'll only touch on straight away. But on the international scene, we have, it's a little different. We have both commercial films and indie films that get kind of almost kind of equal play at film festivals and in terms of like local distribution for different markets. Now, you are a program consultant for a few festivals, such as the San Sebastian International Film Festival and the Udine Far East Film Festival. So given that position, what do you think it is that film festival programmers look for in films, and why do they find it in both the commercial and indie realms of Korean film?
Yeah, well, I think that, good programmers tend to look at films from the perspective of their audiences. And every film festival has a different kind of audience. So, the programmers at the Sitges Film Festival are looking for one type of film. Whereas San Sebastian or Cannes or other film festivals might be approaching it from a different perspective. But basically, I think that the reason that we do see kind of a similar level of programming of independent films and mainstream films is because most programmers are looking for creativity, originality. And certainly there's a lot of creativity in the independent film sector. And so if you're looking for a film that kind of really stands out and that has its own unique personal stamp. You do find commercial films like that, of course, but there are quite a number of independent films as well. And so that's why they're getting a lot of attention.
So then if we look back a little bit, turn back the clock to, I guess, 10 or 15 years ago when Korean films really started to get noticed overseas, what were the kinds of films that were catching the eyes of programmers and buyers, I suppose, at that time? Any kind of you can notice some trends among those films?
It's interesting. Back at that time, I think the gap between independent films and mainstream commercial films was much wider than it is right now. There was a strong activist bent to the independent film community. And those films were targeted in some ways more at the local audience. And documentaries certainly, but also, feature-length fiction films. There weren't as many being made back then as there are now. That's been one big change. Because of the same reasons that have contributed to the explosion in filmmaking in other countries, like the changing technology and everything else. But yeah, I think at that time, 10 years ago, Korean cinema was kind of unknown territory for a lot of people around the world. And it was the commercial films that got noticed first. And directors like Kim Ki-duk and Park Chan-wook. And Kim Ki-duk is a special case because he was doing his own thing on a low budget, and he kind of created his own filmmaking system unto himself. But for the most part, it was in the commercial film industry. And a lot of critics point out that back then, mainstream commercial filmmakers had a bit more creative freedom than they do now. The whole process of making films was somewhat different. And, whereas in some sense it was less professional and streamlined than it is now. There are downsides to that, but the big upside is that it's a little bit easier to kind of sneak through these unusual, quite creative, unexpected moments and genres and things in those films. So back then, I think the focus was more on the mainstream films, but it's different now.
It certainly seems that way. But you already mentioned Kim Ki-duk, and I guess we can add to that Hong Sang-soo, two people that got noticed around the same time, got started around the same time, both in 1996. But those are two independent filmmakers back then, just as they are now, and they've had kind of an enduring appeal. But at the same time, as you mentioned, a lot of the films that we had from 10, 15 years ago, those that are very well known, might have had a very kind of artistic bent, but they weren't necessarily independent films. But now we're seeing a lot more independent films, particularly those that are traveling overseas. And so what kinds of independent films are doing well overseas?
I mean, these days it's more and more common for film students to be shooting feature films as compared to the past when they were shooting short films. And so this is one category of films that are getting some attention. And every year at the Busan Film Festival, we see a number of new independent films released, and a lot of them are either by recent graduates or even, students making their graduation work, a feature-length work. And, they're typically debut features, but many of them have attracted considerable amount of attention in the past few years. At the same time, there are a group of filmmakers who continue to work in the independent film sector, who are kind of gaining a reputation for themselves, are establishing a really interesting filmography. Like Lee Sung-hee is one example. He had Night Flight earlier this year. He's been shooting feature films since 2006. Shin Young-sik is another director. He most recently made the Russian novel and The Avian Kind. The Avian Kind premiered earlier this year at Cheonju. And he's also been working for quite a while, but I think that you get the sense that there's more attention being placed on his work these days as compared to in the past. Jang Gun-jae is another really interesting filmmaker who's now with his third feature film. And so now is kind of an exciting time for independent cinema because, at the same time as we're getting a lot of interesting debut filmmakers, we're able to follow these other filmmakers who, by themselves, without going into the mainstream film industry, are building up a really interesting filmography. And so with each new film, it's a different piece added to the puzzle. And I'm finding myself drawn into their works quite a bit.
Okay. So, Lee Sung-il is a really interesting name because his breakout film was 2006, of course, No Regrets. And that screened at the Berlin International Film Festival. In fact, 3 of his films have screened there. Of course, that is a queer film. And do you think perhaps obviously it's a very good film, but as a queer film, because there weren't that many of them made in Korea, did that make it perhaps more appealing for international programmers?
I know he is a really interesting filmmaker because he's, on the one hand, he's seen as kind of a pioneer. And No Regret was a film that did break out commercially in Korea.
Yeah, it was very successful.
And so it demonstrated kind of the commercial potential of queer films. Whereas before that, I think there was skepticism that a film like that could really kind of break out and reach a wide audience. And so before that as well, his short films had gathered a lot of praise and attention. And so within the independent film community, he was quite a well-known figure. He's a very thoughtful person who writes columns and everything else. And so apart from his filmmaking, he's also been kind of active in supporting independent filmmaking in different ways. But as time goes on, I think at the beginning of the career, he was seen kind of more exclusively as a queer director because he was the most prominent by far in Korea. Whereas now you have more and more making films, and so that's one element of his work, but I think he's getting more attention now for his individual style. And there's a really interesting kind of, there's a bit of romanticism in his films. We can see that in Night Flight. It's a coming of age story. I really like the film, and it screened in Berlin early in the year, and then it opened in theaters at the end of August. and it didn't really break out. Actually, it didn't do as well as No Regret. It didn't receive that kind of attention, but I think those who saw it really liked it quite a bit, and it got a good response from the audience.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan. I really like it. And I'm glad to see it's, while it wasn't a huge hit here, it has been screened at a number of festivals. And it's true that while his other films were more strictly queer films, this one certainly has that as well, but it's a bit of a more sprawling film. And yeah, that there is that kind of this side to his films, kind of poetic realism that is really, really wonderful. So that's a very interesting name for anyone listening out there. If you have a chance to see an Lee Sung-yi film, it's highly recommend it. We have Jang Kon-jae, his new film. Another, I think we're both very big fans of this director's work.
Yeah.
His new film is A Midsummer's Fantasia, which debuted at the Busan International Film Festival this year. That's an interesting case because it's a co-production with Japan. It was selected as a commissioned work for the Nara International Film Festival, which is an event that is staged by Kaoste Naomi, the famous filmmaker who's often been to Cannes. And so she produced this film. So first of all, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, it was really interesting to see him direct a film in a different setting and in different circumstances. His first two films have been shot in Korea, and were very much kind of, I guess, settings that he was quite familiar with. I mean, in some ways, there may have been biographical elements in his first two films. The first one is a coming-of-age story. The second one is shot in his apartment. It's the story of a young couple, and it's a young couple who are facing kind of similar issues to issues that the filmmaker himself was facing in his marriage and decisions about whether to have a baby, that sort of thing. I mean, the third film, it did give him a chance to, first of all, work out of the country for the first time. He was working with a crew that included a lot of Japanese technicians, and to a certain extent, I mean, I don't think, he was working under the tutelage in some ways of Kawase. I don't think that she really, told him what to do or anything, but it's funny because it's shot in many of the same locations as her films.
Okay.
And so in some ways it feels a little bit similar to her style just because of the setting. And he said he struggled with that a little bit because it's almost like if you go to that region and you sit down a camera and you look through the viewfinder, you see a Kawase film. And so he struggled a little bit to put his own personal stamp on it, but I think he was really successful in doing that. And I'm a huge fan of this film. He seems to just keep getting more and more interesting as a filmmaker. And it's not a film that perhaps will really break out and get a huge amount of attention because it is shot on a somewhat small scale, and it's not the type of film that I guess it's a little hard to market.
That's true.
I mean, both to mainstream audiences, but also to festivals in a way, because it's not as eye-catching on when you put it in a program as some other kinds of film, like
it's not a genre film. There's nothing provocative about it.
Yeah.
And it's but I guess the same thing could have been said of Sleepless Nights. I mean, which is a very, very low-key film that is on DV. It's shot. It's 4:3 aspect ratio, which is a little strange almost these days. And it's also like 63 minutes long, which many programmers that I spoke to said, well, we kind of want to show the film, but we can't really screen a 63-minute film. We just can't get audiences interested in that, which is a fair point. But it did end up going to a few places and it won a few awards. But it's definitely going to be a challenge.
Yeah, I think that as his career progresses, I mean, clearly he's someone with a lot of talent. And so with each additional film that he makes, I think he'll pick up additional fans and followers. And so I'm hoping that as time goes on, he gets more recognition. And, I don't really... I'm not necessarily hoping that he moves into mainstream filmmaking or anything like that. I think that he could...
Interesting marriage.
Yeah, I'm perfectly happy to have him continue making films in the same way that he's making them right now, because it seems that with every film he does something quite different.
Certainly, and he puts so much of himself into each film. I mean, he's the main character in all his films, and in some way.
In a way, yeah. He doesn't act on the screen, but the main characters express a lot of his own experiences. Absolutely.
So there's another very interesting director, someone very close to my heart, who I've just tremendously enjoyed his work over the last few years. So before we talk about a few more of these filmmakers, there are quite a number. More recently, we've seen a number of films making an impression on the international stage. But at the same time, the independent industry is quite significant. You had a talk this week, which I was lucky to attend, and Keist, and you were talking about how there's something like 80 or 100 independent Korean films made a year. Of course, only a fraction of those get any real play overseas. So those that do get seen overseas, would you call that kind of group a fair representation of what's happening in the indie scene in Korea as a whole?
I mean, I think that if you look at all of the films that are being made in Korea, it's somewhat more diverse than the group of films that get a lot of festival invitations. Although I think to a certain extent that's to be expected because, I mean, some of the low-budget films that are being made right now, they're interesting and I really enjoy watching them, but you wouldn't say that they're, incredibly original or groundbreaking in any way. And so in a way, you could say that they don't really deserve like a huge, widespread festival exposure. And yet, on the other hand, I think that they do have an audience, a potential audience, and that these films, when you watch them, they're quite interesting and enjoyable, and they feel very different from mainstream commercial films. And so I think it's kind of a task for the film industry as a whole to take films like this that I think would appeal to many viewers in Korea if they had a chance to watch them and to find a way to get these films exposed to those viewers. It's hard because obviously the big expensive films that are being pushed by the big film companies are the ones that get the most exposure. But if we can encourage all different types of viewers in Korea to be a little bit more adventurous and to look out a little bit more for films that are shot on a smaller scale but might be just as interesting, then we can find an audience for those other films.
There's, as you say, there's just a huge amount of challenges there. There's we can talk about the vertically integrated system where, although there's a healthy number of art houses in Korea, or at least in Seoul, they don't have the same kind of marketing heft and the same visibility. And it's not they're not in department stores. There's this kind of wholesale event of the cinema in Korea these days where you go and do, you have to go to a department store and you go to a cafe, you go to a restaurant, you do it all kind of in-house. And the art house is a bit of a different experience.
Yeah, it's true. There are a couple interesting examples from the past year that one of them that did find a bit of an audience and one of them that didn't. And the one that did was The King of Joku, which is a comedy. It's a low-budget comedy that has a lot of appeal. I think especially for Koreans who, because its subject matter is very Korean. And Joku is this, I don't know if it's exclusive to Korea. I never came across it when I was living in the US, but perhaps in other parts of Asia. I'm curious if in Japan they play this, but where it's sort of like volleyball with a soccer ball and you don't use your hands. But Joku is something that used to be much more common at universities, and it's somewhat fallen out of favor, and the main character is very enthusiastic about it. So when he returns from his military service, he tries to get a team at his university, and he has to kind of compete with the sneers of all his fellow students who think it's no longer very cool to do something like that. This film, it opened in August, and it never was screening on a wide number of screens. It wasn't a film that really broke out into the multiplexes, but week by week, it just accumulated a bit more, and so this film has over 45,000 admissions now, which for an independent film is really quite a strong showing, and it has gotten a fair amount of attention in the press, and so this has been a success story. That's the kind of film that I don't think would get a lot of attention from international film festivals.
That's true. It's still, the humor is not necessarily local, but just the context certainly is.
Yeah, and the storytelling is not particularly innovative in that sense. They're not trying to make something
that's
very different from other kinds of films that came before it.
But that's almost why it works, because it's a very unassuming film.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
I think, as you mentioned earlier this week, the fact that it's a light comedy, and there's this image of the Korean independent film as kind of pretty dour and dealing with like the various socio-political issues in Korea. And this is not that at all. And it's very light. It's a fun, breezy sports comedy. And actually, it reminds me of another recent small indie that I loved, but unfortunately didn't do quite as well, Super Virgin.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, which was wonderful. But that took a long time to get released. It was released this year, wasn't it?
Yeah, this is a film that it's first screened at the Busan Film Festival. And I think the people who saw it enjoyed it quite a bit. It's a almost zero budget movie made by the director and a group of his friends. But there's a lot of humor in the film. There's a lot of energy in the film. And it was a case where it kind of dropped off the radar for a couple of years. And then somebody programmed it at the Chuseok Film Festival last year, which screened at Art9 Theater. And the owner of Art9 Theater got the chance to see the film for the first time there. And it was him who ended up distributing it.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
And so he discovered it somewhat late, but really wanted to push the film. And so
I'm very glad it got a release. It's a wonderful little film. But talking about some bigger indie films, or I guess current ones anyway. Well, first we can talk about a film that we've had mixed opinions about. Is Hangongju, which of course has been a huge success on the global scene. After winning a few awards in Busan last year, it took top honors at Marrakesh, Rotterdam, Fribourg, a number of awards at the Deauville Asian Film Festival, and has just gone on and on and on. And then even in Korea, it was, one of the most successful independent films of all time.
Yeah, I mean, in the past 5 years, I guess, there have been just a few kind of very successful Korean independent films that have won just a surprising number of awards and have really touched a nerve overseas. And Breathless was one from 2009. It seemed like every festival that movie screened in, it ended up taking home an award. Either for the director, Yang Ik-jun, or for the actress, Kim Go-bi. So that clearly was a very, very successful film. The Journals of Musan, the debut of Park Jung-bum, about a North Korean defector who's living in Seoul and kind of struggling to adapt to the society in Seoul. This was another film that practically everywhere it went, it took home the top prize, won 15 or 20 festival awards.
Enormous amount.
And Hangongju sort of fits within that category. I mean, Jisoo also did very well after winning the top prize at Sundance's World Cinema competition section. It screened at many festivals and also did very, very well locally. And this year's big independent film is clearly Hangongju. It premiered last year at Busan, and this year it's been traveling both around the world, but also really broke out locally.
Absolutely. It must have been 250,000 admissions, thereabouts.
Yep.
And I mean, in recent times, you mentioned already Jisoo, which went over 100,000. I mean, we use this benchmark of 10,000 being a kind of a big success, for an independent film. So when something hits 100,000, which is absolutely nothing for a commercial movie, it's a huge deal for an indie. And we have Breathless was one as well, I think, and not very many. Some early Hong Sang-soo films maybe crossed 100,000, but a big mark. So what else? What other films are doing very well in the international scene right now? Kind of this in the indie sector.
There are a number of them. A number of films have been receiving a lot of festival invitations. One of them is A Girl at My Door, which premiered at Cannes. It's a debut film by Jung Juri, Jalai Jung, who is a really talented screenwriter and director, I think. And this film stars Bae Do-na and Kim Se-ron. And so it had a bit of star power from the beginning. And perhaps it had a bit more profile from the beginning, I think, than the average Korean independent film because of its cast. And because Lee Chang-dong was also a producer of the film. But it's one of my favorite films of the year. I thought it was really well directed and scripted and executed. It has a lot of really interesting complexity to the characterizations. So it's a film that you could watch, I think, several times and continue to discover new things about it with each viewing.
So yeah, I look forward to watching it again. Actually, I was really floored by it when I first saw it, but I've only seen it in May. I need to get back to it. But yeah, that's interesting because it is a film that has a bit of clout, although it is certainly independent. I mean, I guess it was CGV Movie Collage was the backer of that film, though of course CJ Entertainment came in and was able to help it. It didn't do particularly well in Korea. I mean, for an independent film, it made a lot. Maybe it was, again, over 200,000 admissions. But for it was kind of almost viewed as more mainstream, and so on that level, it's seen as a failure.
I know there's an interesting issue of scale when we're talking about independent films, because films that only screen in theaters that specialize in art house films or independent films, for those type of releases, I mean, 10,000 is a really decent performance. However, if films are able to kind of break out of that circuit and to screen in ordinary multiplexes, and especially if they have a well-known star, Kyungju is another example from earlier this year, which starred Park Hye-il and Shin Min-ah. I mean, two really recognizable actors. A lot of viewers, I think, would go just on the basis of the cast, and yet the film is not a commercial film. I mean, it's a challenging film in many ways. I think that if you simply go in looking for entertainment, then you might be frustrated because it's a film that is challenging in many ways. But it kind of occupies this middle sphere where it is an independent film. It was shot on a very low budget, but because of its cast, it was able to open on a much wider scale than the average independent film. And so when we look at that sort of film, which made 60,000 tickets, you can say, yes, that's more than The King of Joku, which made 45. On the other hand, King of Joku was a real kind of word-of-mouth hit, whereas I think Kyungju was a film that, I don't know, I guess they were a bit disappointed because they thought that with this cast, they might be able to push it a little bit further into the mainstream. But in the end, it's not that commercial a film, and so I think that perhaps that was a reasonable level in terms of expectations.
Absolutely. And that's a film that's done, again, fairly well on the international circuit. It's screened in competition in Locarno. It was part of the showcase in Toronto this year, and I think a few other places as well, including Busan, of course. Another film that has been to all three of those festivals is Alive, which is the new film by Park Jong-bom. We already discussed Journals of Busan. Now, speaking of difficult films, this one, it's 3 hours. It's kind of unremittingly bleak. It's a really austere film set in the Gangwon-do Mountains, and it's really something. It's I'm a huge fan. I really, really like it. Even though it's 3 hours, I know it's not going to work for everyone, but it's a really wonderful film that it says a lot, and it does it in a very eloquent way, in a very unique way. And again, Park Jong-bom, who starred in Journals of Busan as well, is also the star in this, and he's a very unique presence to lead a film, but he's also very magnetic. And the film has done well overseas. I mean, it's screening in Locarno and a few other places as I've already mentioned. So what's your take on that film's kind of a relative success for the time being?
Yeah, I mean, I think this really demonstrates the fact that when we look at these very long, very slow films, 3-hour films in which the plot progresses very slowly, if you're a really talented filmmaker, if your directing skills are really top-notch, you can turn that into a really memorable and enjoyable watch. I mean, not every director can do that, and some directors try and are less successful with that. But clearly, I mean, this demonstrates his talent, and its reception overseas has been very strong. I guess it'll open in Korea probably early next year, and yeah, it's a big step forward for the director. I mean, clearly his debut film established him as a really important filmmaker. But the sophomore feature is often a challenge for many filmmakers because they don't know. It can be a
stumbling block for many people.
Yeah, you have to follow up your initial success, and I think he was quite successful in taking that to the next level.
Yeah, he's done something with more scale, but at the same time, it doesn't overreach, and it's something quite different.
Yeah, we should mention also that he acts in this film as well as in Journals of Busan.
Right. Yeah, he's a very interesting leading man in that.
Yeah, I think is as talented as an actor as he is as a director.
Yeah, which I think people don't necessarily recognize straight away. Very quickly, what might be some of the indie films to look forward to, in either things that you've had a chance to see that haven't spread around yet, or things that are currently being made?
I mean, the one that I'm most looking forward to for 2015 is Seoul Station, which is a new animated film by director Yan Sang-ho. He's already quite well known because The King of Pigs, his debut film, was it was new. It's kind of new for Korea because in the past, when you talked about independent animation, you were usually talking about short films, and King of Pigs kind of marked the point at which there were feature animated independent films kind of added to the mix. And so there are more and more of those coming out these days. And King of Pigs was very successful. It's not a kid's movie in any way. It's a very dark, tough movie. And then he followed that up with The Fake from a couple of years ago, which was also just a really strong film with really complex characterization, and it raises all these really difficult moral themes in his work. It's a story about a swindler who goes out to the countryside and sets up a church in the hope of kind of taking all the villagers' money.
It's an incredibly dark film.
Yeah. And so his new film is, a bit more in a genre direction. I guess it's a zombie movie, but I don't think it's going to be mainstream in that sense. I'm sure that it will be of interest to both festivals and also, fans of his previous work.
Absolutely. And it has a pretty big voice cast. Ri Sung-yong and Shi Min-gyong are part of it as far as I know.
Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to that film. I think we're going to get a really interesting work in many ways.
Absolutely. Very curious for that one. So before we finish this episode, you, of course, are somewhat of a central figure in Korean independent film, not least because you've acted in many of them.
A couple, not many.
But because you recently started the Wildflower Independent Film Awards, which, as you said yourself, is kind of a Korean version of the Independent Spirit Awards in America, or the BAFTA Independent the British Independent Film Awards in the UK. So can you tell us a little bit about the Wildflower Awards?
Yeah, basically, we made this because I think that there's a need for more marketing of independent films. And, individual films need more marketing. And so the Korean Film Council does some funding for that to provide some help. And it's a continual struggle to market individual films. But I think that an award ceremony like this can function in kind of a more long-term way and a broader way, and just trying to generate more interest in the independent films that are coming out every year. And so it's not a film festival. It's a award ceremony that recognizes the independent films that were released commercially in the previous year.
So you did screen a few films this
year.
Yeah,
that's right. We did have screenings.
Mm-hmm.
And so we plan to do that next March as well when we have the second edition. But the main focus of the event is the kind of awards night, where we'll present about 10 awards to actors, cinematographers, directors whose work has come out in the course of 2014.
So who are some of the big winners for the first edition?
Well, Jisoo took home the top award in the fiction film category. Also, Scenery by Zhang Lu was the top documentary.
It's the director of Gyeongju, of course.
Yeah, it was his first foray into documentaries, and it was a really interesting work. And so I hope that he makes more documentaries in the future, but it was good to recognize that film because it opened in December of last year, and it sort of faded quickly without getting a lot of attention. There was a shorter version of the film that screened at the Cheonju Film Festival, and Cheonju was one of the sponsors of, they funded this film. But this was a way that, I don't know, giving an award like this, it can't really help the film commercially because the film has already been released. And so in a sense, it's reaching the end of its life cycle. But we hope that we can kind of put more focus on the director, perhaps, and encourage people maybe not to forget about this film and to go and, search it out on their own and perhaps watch it at home. Because there are a lot of films coming out this, every year that are in danger of being forgotten if we don't give them enough attention and we give them enough press. Yeah, so an award ceremony like this, it kind of plays one role in the broader effort to promote and to market independent films. It plays a different kind of role than the independent film festivals that are taking place in Korea. But I hope that it contributes in some meaningful way.
Absolutely. I think it's a wonderful initiative. I'm very glad to see an event that kind of focuses on independent film. We seldom see indie films nominated at the major film awards in Korea. And best of luck with the next edition.
Thank you.
And with that, we're out of time. And thank you very much for joining us for this really exciting talk about independent film. Lots of great films are making the rounds at the moment. Plenty more on the way. So thank you very much.
Okay, it was my pleasure.
And that's it for this episode of Korean Cinema Today. We hope you've enjoyed it, and tune in again next time.